Okay, guys, make sure you have your note sheet out. What we're taking a look at this weekend is the development of the American Empire, specifically imperial activity in the late 19th and early 20th century. So as we've talked about, imperialism basically breaks down to when a larger country takes over a smaller location for a variety of reasons. From the mid-1800s through the early 1900s, powerful nations engaged in what we can call a mad dash to extend their influence across much of the world. Following European success of acquiring colonies in both Africa and Asia, the United States became the next major power to assert its domination over weaker territories. So what we're going to try to understand by the end of this is how and why did the United States take a more active role in world affairs. First thing I want to start out with is, as you take a look at this map here, realize that expansion is not a new idea. We've talked about this quite a bit with the Louisiana Purchase, quite a bit of land that was annexed from the Mexican-American War, which took place from 1846 to 1848, in which we had not only annexed Texas, but what resulted in New Mexico ceding much of what is now the southwest United States. You notice how basically at this point in time, by 1853, that the United States had closed the continental portion of our country. And Frederick Jackson Turner, a historian, came up with this theory known as the frontier theory, stating that the closing of the American frontier would lead to all sorts of conflict, and therefore we must expand abroad to avoid this. Theodore Roosevelt in 1897 stated this quote in which he said, "In strict confidence, I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one." Well, this is kind of a demonstration of, the early thoughts of America becoming a larger imperial power, and we'll see exactly how this occurs. So when we talk about American expansion, as we've talked about with the war with Mexico, this is probably one of the last major ways in which the United States expanded the continental United States, as we've just discussed. But beyond that, as we talked about the Monroe Doctrine previously, which was issued in 1823, it made plain to European nations that the United States considered Latin America within its sphere of influence. Not long after that, the United States would be thinking into other parts as well. If we take a look at this map here, we would expand well beyond our borders into places such as Alaska, Hawaii, Cuba and Puerto Rico, China, Japan, the Philippines, and Guam. And what we're going to take a look at as we examine the origins here is specifically the motives of imperialism, a little bit beyond what we talked about the other day. So reasons for empire building. This is kind of interesting political cartoon when on the right you have President William McKinley acting as a waiter for Uncle Sam, and obviously with the caption says, "Well, I hardly know which to take first," and it's almost examining the different countries which are nearby, some closer than others, as what they're going to take first, as if it was an actual restaurant menu. So the first major reason or motive for imperialism, I guess we can call it a military strength or a competition with foreign powers. Early on, Alfred T. Mahan, a military historian, asserted for thousands of years, the most successful civilizations owed their greatness to powerful navies. So America, heavily influenced by Mahan's ideas, expanded and modernized the Navy by developing steam-powered and steel-plated battleships, such as this one right here, which would become to be known as the USS Maine, which will gain even greater fame as we continue with this topic. By 1900, the United States had the third largest Navy in the world, and eventually foreign bases would be needed for purposes of refueling and resupply as well. So this was almost, I guess we can call, necessary for military expansion or keeping up with the Joneses. And it was a famous quote from a Washington Post article which said, "The taste of empire is in the mouth of people, even as the taste of blood is in the jungle." So in this case, it almost sounds like it's natural. One of the next motives which I want to discuss with you is the commercial opportunities or the economic benefits. As we've talked about with industrials, we see John D. Rockefeller here. His Standard Oil Company accounted for roughly 90% of American exports, so goods leaving the country, specifically kerosene, and he controlled essentially 70% of this market worldwide. Oil became second to cotton as the leading product sent overseas. In terms of what other nations were doing, powerful nations sought out raw materials and natural resources that were limited within their own countries. This is an example of what we call an extractive economy. Imperial countries would extract or remove raw materials from smaller colonies and then ship them back to their home countries. This wasn't so much the problem for the United States, as there was not really a shortage of materials at the time, rather too much of a surplus of goods. So as we've talked about with issues that farmers were facing and industrials were facing, where goods could not be purchased in greater amounts within the country, many industrials urged that overseas markets should be open to sell American goods. So for Americans, foreign markets was the key to economic success at home. The third one, I guess we can call social Darwinism, or a civilizing of the non-white races. So there was definitely a yearning to demonstrate strength and resolve to establish nation states based upon American values. So in both these images that you see here, a soap article on the right side for Pears soap, and then a political cartoon on the right side where we have a troop carrying what would be considered probably an uncivilized man, because he's not a white American being sent to a schoolhouse. These kind of follow the ideas of a poem that was known as The White Man's Burden, and essentially within it saying that it was the job of the more civilized races, in this case the United States, to do what they could to help those who were unlike them. So civilizing and educating non-white races, but ultimately it really breaks down to the idea of social Darwinism. So the racial and cultural superiority was really a primary motive for many of the expansionist nations to justify the takeover of smaller, less developed nations. We talked about during Manifest Destiny, Americans held the idea that God granted them the right and responsibility to rule over people for positive reasons. This is kind of an extension of that idea. As we talked about and what we've seen with Howard Zinn, he said expansion overseas might especially be appealing if it looked like an act of generosity, helping a rebellious group overthrow foreign rule. So what we'll see in cases in which this will happen eventually, the Spanish-American War, where we go to aid smaller nations from other imperial powers, we're trying to promote peace and democracy, but there was at times that we kept the land that we tried to assist. So moving on to the next part and last part, I wanted to just kind of briefly touch on America's initial steps towards becoming a world power. So we're dating back prior to the Civil War, with the first thing I want to mention is in 1853, Commodore Matthew Perry sailed a fleet of ships to what is present-day Japan. By lavishly showering Japan's emperor with gifts, America would come to be one of the first countries that would be allowed to actually trade with Japan. If we fast forward 14 years, Secretary of State William Seward, as we see in the left part of this image, and Andrew Johnson on the right, President Andrew Johnson on the right, are carrying something that says Russian America, which we now know as the state of Alaska. So in 1867, Secretary of State Seward purchased Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. So while journalists playfully called the purchase Seward's folly, the purchase nearly doubled the size of the United States and would eventually become a major source of oil and timber. Commodore Perry's journey to East Asia would eventually lead to an 1867 trip that will allow the United States to take possession of the Midway Islands. As we notice, the location of the Midway Islands, not too far, terribly far I should say, to the west of the Midway Islands is Hawaii. In 1875 and 1887, increased trade would exist with the Hawaiian Islands to the extent that the naval base that we now know as Pearl Harbor would eventually be built. Hawaii's got a little bit of a history. So since the late 18th century, American planters had established plantations on the island for sugarcane. In 1887, American planters were given the right to vote, making them primarily the only eligible voters on the island. This changed in 1891 when Queen Liliuokalani assumed power of the Hawaiian throne, and she overwhelmingly resented the influence that white planters had gained over several decades, and she essentially abolished the Constitution that gave them their voting rights and other significant powers. So seeing this as a major threat, with the support of the United States military, white planters seized and placed wealthy planter Sanford B. Dole, hence Dole Fruits, in control of the island until it was annexed. While the majority of Hawaiian people did not approve the treaty for annexation, and it took quite a while, American sentiment for annexation remained strong. And eventually in 1898, Hawaii was annexed and officially became a territory of the United States.